Hi, this is Vetting Curriculum, Identifying and Revising Curriculum for Anti-Racist Teaching. This presentation was conducted on September 8th. However, we're doing a recording for those of you who would like to use this presentation to inform their teaching and learning or curriculum adoption, textbook adoption, or if you really just want to um, use it for professional development. So I'm here with Dr. Nick Henning. And
Well,
we're
hi.
your webinar leaders.
Yeah. Hi everybody. Like Dr. Linton said, we're recording this for posterity so that you can use it for your own professional development individually, but hopefully you can use it for your own professional development collectively with others, a large group of people, another like-minded colleague who's interested in this topic of vetting curriculum for anti-racist teaching. We are colleagues within the Department of Secondary Education at Cal State Fullerton. And we both taught in secondary classrooms and loved it.
Loved it. Definitely loved it.
And wish I could go back sometimes.
I definitely miss it.
But yeah, and we're both folks whose scholarship and teaching focuses on the many different aspects of what we're going to call anti-racist teaching today. Myself in the social studies, and Dr. Linton in science education and other related fields. So go for it, Antoine.
Okay.
What else do you want to say?
So the purpose of the workshop is to share a process for identifying, vetting, and revising curriculum to specifically be anti-racist. So this is an inclusive, rigorous process. We want to share with you today that by doing this, it is it's actually a benefit to the children. Representation matters. Engaging students so that they have agency in their own learning matters. And specifically with African American and Latinx students, we're investing in their intellectual capital so that they could be first-class citizens in their own communities and beyond. So this is about shoring up our own practices so that we can be of benefit to the children. So we're going to be discussing the ways that we find, analyze, and use curriculum. We're going to be providing a wonderful vetting tool that's really comprehensive for anti-racist teaching and discuss the ways that we can use it in the classroom and use it in our professional development. There is a presentation. We're not going to show it to you during this recording, but the link is in the presentation and we'll be sharing that with you when we upload the presentation on how curriculum can be used in a racist fashion and how we can use the vetting tool to discuss corrections to that curriculum. And then we have a vetting discussion and enacting curriculum, and then we leave room at the end for Q&A.
And we will be revising it, not revising that regular overview, but in terms of the Q&A, obviously we can't do that live. So that might be an extra time that you could use to kind of discuss with whoever you're working with on this.
Absolutely.
And we also will have the vetting checklist will be available in a PDF or through this presentation. We'll make sure that's available so you can review that.
Absolutely. Before we get started, we want to make clear about some of the terminology that we're using when we talk about anti-racist curriculum and anti-racist teaching practice and pedagogy. So anti-racist curriculum is the intentional organization of the discipline that leads to equity between racialized ethnic groups and is substantiated by anti-racist ideas about what knowledge is, who the knower is, and the epistemology and what the learner contributes to the learning and the teaching in the classroom. anti-racist teaching practice was an integration of Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's definition of anti-racism and Dr. Etta Holland's concept of teaching practice. And this is one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. And using this as a guide, we've developed a definition of what it means to be an anti-racist teacher as one who plans for, enacts and interprets and translates student learning outcomes that reliably produce epistemic, intellectual, and creative agency that empower students to pursue the professional endeavors of their choosing. And the reason why I put that together that way, because Dr. Henning and I were just talking about how none of the kids are meeting proficiency in literacy, mathematics, science, history. So to get the racial groups equal is still not good enough. So we have to get them to the point where they can actually choose to be whoever they want to be. And I think that that's a more healthy way of looking at it, so that we can definitely increase the performance of our African American and Latinx kids, but we don't forget that we're also failing white and Asian kids too. And so lastly, anti-racist pedagogy comes from the integration of course, Kendi's work and Etta's work, but this also brings about Dr. Peter Morrell, who is now our ancestor. He defined pedagogy as a system of practices that includes socially, culturally, and historically grounded reflections that influence teacher practice, which is the planning, enactment of learning episodes, and interpretation and translation of student performance outcomes. And these practices are used to intentionally empower children to define themselves as capable and epistemologically literate human beings. So we're integrating concepts together so that we know and can map out where we're going. And curriculum vetting is a part of that planning practice that we're going to be focusing on today.
And yeah, so on this next slide, so now we talked about the kind of the working definitions, and as Dr. Linton was talking about, it is a combination, right, of different bodies of work to talk about this idea of what is anti-racist curriculum. But in terms of vetting anti-racist curriculum, the grounding framework that we developed for the purpose of this presentation is that we believe that anti-racist materials and methods do the following. Number one, and it is very possible that this is one of the most important and the most often left out, is this idea of humanizing and restoring the dignity of the kids that are in our classroom, right? So this idea that we have to restore dignity, and of course we have to sustain that, right? And then allow that to be continually developed, that humanization and restoration. Mm-hmm. And then second, to provide a way to call out racism and provides healing processes for kids. So the idea is, yeah, we're going to call it out, sort of guided by many folks' definitions, but Dr. Kendi, in our definition, talking about that in order to be anti-racist, I have to be anti-racist, right? When I see racism, I have to be anti it. I have to speak out against it. I have to act against it. So that seems important. And I think most people who are going to be in this, who are going to be watching this presentation like yourself, you're going to be down for that. But the other piece is understanding that racism does, and will continue to cause incredible harm to children. So how can we call it out, but then also now, what are we putting in its place? What are we putting going on so that children might heal, so that may be as healthy as possible, so that idea, again, the humanization and restoration of dignity would be an important part of that.
Absolutely.
And then as Dr. Linton was saying, focus on that these materials and methods focus on personal and academic development of African American and Latinx children, and acknowledging that this focus helps all children, right? So although our focus may be in this work and in this presentation today about the personal academic development of African American and Latinx children, this is actually something that benefits all children. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, the intention is to approach learning in a holistic way, and that children leave the learning situation feeling whole, right? So many of our kids and Antoinette, we were just talking about this previously too. So many kids, number one, they may at home, right, and in community, they may feel completely whole, right? But when they come to schools, they are made to not feel complete. They are made to not feel whole. And so we want, through these anti-racist materials and methods, that we're hopeful that you will be able to vet in a more effective way after going through this process that we're about to present, is that part of that is not only, again, to call out racism, to be anti-racist, but also to provide a space where kids are left feeling healthy and whole and feel and know themselves.
Yes.
Right. And they can be themselves.
Absolutely.
Which is something we were talking about before too.
I have a saying when I'm teaching the candidates and when I'm working with teachers, kids should feel more like themselves after you've taught them than before. Through your teaching, they should discover more about who they are and feel good about that. Like they can learn, they can express what they, in prior knowledge and funds of knowledge, those things are valued, and they can go, oh my goodness, I thought I could only use this in my community, but I can use it beyond. And that is what brings a level of continuity and constitution about the South that I've always aimed as a teacher to, it's part of the purpose of my teaching. Not only am I getting you to be little scientists or a biologist or chemist, but I'm also trying to create a space where you discover something about yourself that you can be proud of. And that's not pushing assimilation. No, I want you to use your language. I want you to use your identity and your pride and your culture and your socialization here in this space. And I want you to go, this is not something that is foreign to me. This is me embodying my historical legacy and my birthright as a human being in this space. And it's in Spanish or in Japanese or Mandarin. It's historic, crosses space and time. And now I can share something that I already had with my community in a different way. And I think that that's very powerful for this presentation.
Yeah, more of that, please. So our first activity we wanted to do, and you can set this up however you want, in pairs and small groups, but we designed it as a paired chat. So you can push pause in the presentation, you can do it wherever you want. But we had in our group, for the sake of time, you could go longer, you could go shorter, but we had 6 minutes as a time limit for this chat. And so the question, right, and so first of all, before we get into what that question is that you might discuss in your pairs or small groups, is just establishing some norms for those discussions. You may be with people that you feel comfortable with, that you're like, yeah, okay, we're gonna talk it up, we're gonna chop it up, that's all good. But you also may be in a place where you need to just establish some norms and some agreements around what that means to come together and talk about what we're going to talk about today. So, 3 kind of principles of our norms in this space would be to be present, right? If you are in an online space, which you likely are, to invite you to turn on your camera and to actively engage in our conversation. Obviously, some folks, we can't turn on a camera, we got things going on, we may have bandwidth issues, whatever, but to be encouraged to get as much feedback, verbal and nonverbal, that we can through this space, either in person or online. And then number 2, to be respectful, right? That this will be a space where, hopefully we disagree to some degree, right. And challenge each other, right? But that we agree respectfully and that we disagree respectfully, and that's an important thing. And then 3rd, possibly to experience some discomfort, right? Share to the degree you feel comfortable, but sometimes discomfort can lead to transformative learning. And in fact, there are many folks that would say that that's one of the ways that we really get some good transformative learning, is through discomfort, through things that make us uncomfortable to certain degrees. That can, create some cognitive shifts if we're just thinking about the cognitive realm. So the question that we wanted you to talk about is, so if you can imagine your subject area, or if you're in a multiple subject classroom, preschool environment, post-secondary, higher education, all that, If you wanted to find or create anti-racist curriculum for tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
or for the rest of the year, where do you look, or would you look, and what do you look for?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's the questions we want to ask, is to think about, if you wanted to create anti-racist curriculum, where do you look? Where would you look? Where would you look for it? I'm sorry, where would you look for it?
Where would you look?
So yeah,
And what would you look for?
yeah, what are the things that you would look for to say that, okay, this might be anti-racist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And thinking of things outside of, well, first step for most people these days is to say, I put go to Google and I in quotes I put anti-racist curriculum, right? Search that. Let's see what comes up. There will be things that will come up. But what are once I begin to parse through that, what are the questions that I'm asking of it?
Right.
As well as what might be other sources of curriculum other than just what's on the internet. Not that it's not a good source, but there are other sources too.
Absolutely. I would, as a teacher, I've only taught in the K through 12 space, I only taught brown and Black children. So I was always looking for imagery of African American and Latinx scientists, narratives, quotes, but I was always looking for, not only is the curriculum representative of the students that I was teaching, but is it also aligned with the practices that I want them to master? So I was always looking for both of those things. And what ended up happening often was I always ended up in some history, right? I was looking for science stuff, but I always ended up with some sort of historical connection as well. So that was always my result when I was trying to supplement the curriculum that was assigned to us in the classroom. So.
Yeah, and for me it was the opposite. Being a history social studies teacher, I would do the opposite. I would actually find things in science. I would find things in art. I would find things in humanities and language arts, and because I think that in concert with what we're talking about here, and if we're thinking about, since we're in the secondary education department, we're thinking about a single subject, especially if you're thinking about multi-subject, but that idea of the need and I think the requirement that we be interdisciplinary, that we connect those dots, that we show students, even though they may already know that, but to show students again that all of these different things are connected and all of these different disciplines actually answer a lot of the same questions. They're trying to answer a lot of the same questions. And so how could we find agreement in terms of the materials that we're using and crossover between those things, making those connections, and then of course, creating and modeling the asking of questions that have that kind of universal human appeal, looking to solve mysteries, right? That are kind of continual in human experience.
Absolutely. So if you're viewing this in an actual professional development, you can hit pause and go through the paired chat together and make your ideas public for your colleagues. If you're thinking, summarize what you're thinking about and talking about in your chat, and maybe formulate something to share with the whole group after your 6 minutes is done.
All right, so you're back, and hopefully your paired chat went well, or your discussion and the share out afterwards, and you've got some good ideas about what things you might look for, what you're thinking is right now in terms of that, and then also where you would look for anti-racist curriculum. But one resource that we want to present, we've shared with you either through email or through the presentation itself. You should have it available for you, the PDF, which is the vetting curriculum checklist. I believe that's what it's titled. It's a PDF. And so you can open up that right now if you haven't already. If you were a good student and looked ahead, you may have already seen it. But we kind of developed this list of questions, and very, very, very much inspired, especially the first 10 or so, actually directly inspired. And I would actually want to put the citation that the book that myself and two co-authors, Ruchi Agarwal-Ragnath and Alison Dover, who is another colleague of ours in the Department of Secondary Education, we wrote a book that was published 4 years ago, which you see there, Preparing to Teach Social Studies for Social Justice, Becoming a Renegade. Ooh, so it's a very provocative renegade title. But the basic point of the book is we put out a call for letters from veteran teachers who identify themselves as justice-oriented teachers in social studies. So they're teaching towards social justice, and to write letters of advice to new teachers. And so we received a number of letters from all over the country from those veteran teachers, and then looked at those data and developed some themes of advice, basically, that was given. And one of our chapters talks about, sort of what does it mean to write or collect or develop a justice-oriented curriculum. And there was one teacher who is actually a former student of mine. He's just an incredible teacher now. He's now a trainer within a group called Facing History in Ourselves, and Jared Kushida. And so Jared Kushida put forth in his quite lengthy and involved letter, he put forward this this list of questions that he asks every time he writes or creates or compiles curriculum. And so for him, these are all really, really important questions that he has to ask of everything. And if it's not hitting on some of them, he tries to figure out what can I change or add or delete or whatever to this curriculum in order to make it so that it hits on all of them. And it's quite that's a difficult thing to do when we look at these different items. But these, for us, were some of the important questions. And then there are some additional ones that aren't necessarily Jared's, but we found them to be equally as important. So the first question is, when we look at something, so, in your pairs, you talked about, well, what am I going to look for? Well, the first question that Jared asked, and the first question we have on our list is the curriculum, the unit, the lesson, whatever it is, the activity, is it a red pill lesson, right? So for those of you, and I hope it's all of you, who have seen The Matrix, and especially the first one, right? There's a character Morpheus, and he basically gives the lead character, Neo, the choice of, hey, you can take the red pill or you can take this blue pill. The blue pill will put you back in the world where you were, which you were basically plugged into a computer and you thought you were living a real life, and you really weren't. You were just a battery for the computer, but you go back to that ignorance, that happy ignorance. Or you take the red pill and you get ejected from that, and you figure out that, wow, I'm just a big battery, and the computers rule the entire earth, and et cetera, et cetera. So the red pill lesson means, is it truthful, right? It doesn't tell the truth about actually what has happened, right? Or what is happening, or what will happen. Right? When we think about science, and we think about climate change, well, what has happened, what is happening, and what will for sure happen if we don't do something about it. So thinking about, does it really tell the truth? Do you want to do the next one, Antoinette? Do you want to kind of alternate on these?
Sure. So content heaviness, is it a developmentally appropriate I hear a lot of my students say, we like to do hands-on because it's science. And I'm like, let's move away from thinking that just engaging unintentionally with stuff or remotely with things. Let's talk about approximations of practice, right? Because when I look in my candidates or my teacher's classroom and they're teaching chemistry, I expect for them to be engaging in chemistry along with other ways of thinking and being. But if I look into your classroom and you calling yourself have an anti-racist curriculum, but all the students are doing is doing a bunch of worksheets, even though some of the prompts in those worksheets get them to think. But if they're not doing science, then that's not being anti-racist. Black and brown children and all children, especially in secondary, should be engaging in approximations of practice that are developmentally appropriate for them. So they understand how social scientists think and how they do things, and they can examine how scientists and writers argue and document information and justify what they're doing, um, so that they can then do the next step, which is be critical.
Yeah, and so the question of is it critical is, are students going to analyze, evaluate, and question enough, right? So that they'll kind of three-part process of, are they analyzing, are they evaluating, and are they asking questions? Are they questioning things, right? So this, they're just not just like questioning things, but that idea of analyzing and evaluating. Absolutely. And then the third one being dialectical, right? Are students going to have the space to dialogue about their ideas? Right. So do we have interactions and dialogue happening in, for example, like the pairs that you just did, groups of 3, groups of 4, groups of 5? Do we have a fishbowl? Do we have a Socratic seminar that happens within this? So that idea of, do they have space to dialogue? And there may be spaces that are structured, right, which have certain protocol, which have certain traditions and guidelines that have an order of things. This happens first, da, da, da. Right. And they also may just be very open and free form. It may create space that is more up to students, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to have both, because in a dialectical environment, students then add to the curriculum themselves. So if everything's always structured and you're centering the teacher's voice, and you're also centering whoever the hell made that curriculum. And part of being critical and dialectical is that students get an opportunity to sit in the middle of that and question the legitimacy of whoever is the quote unquote expert that you guys are studying at that time. So there's nothing wrong with a critique, especially like myself in science, where history is what validates a lot of the content in textbooks. If you're a science teacher viewing this, I want to say podcast, if you're a scientist viewing this presentation, you know that at the beginning of every unit, they're going to have a bunch of white people with a timeline talking about who discovered what and what instruments they use, right? It is up to us to point that out and say, what was going on, throughout the rest of the world or within this country at that same time? Why is it that all of a sudden these folks, right, these folks are the center of that discussion, when we know parts of Africa, the Americas, and Asia were also doing some things. So, maybe there was some cross-cultural concepts that were happening at that time that led to this kind of Europeanized central idea that is being presented as, oh, it just rooted about itself. I always pose that question. And then I would go and find evidence in the historical record to say, actually, a lot of these things globally were happening at that time that allowed this particular European to be centered. They didn't just grow themselves out of history. So that then leads to those dialogues, and being critical then lead to problem posing, right? So we can use the problems posed in the curriculum, but 9 times out of 10, the kids are going to come up with better problems to solve than what's presented in the curriculum. And you want to leave space for problematizing not only the subject, but the legitimacy of how the subject is presented. You want them to engage in a process of looking at all the factors, questioning what is missing, and then through the subject matter, however they engage in inquiry, you want them to set up their own inquiry into the topic. And let me tell you, when you do that, kids not only learn the subject, but they learn how to interrogate the subject, and they don't fall for the okie doke when they're older, because they've had the habit of mind of problem posing in this manner.
Yeah, and that problem posing piece, right, came, I believe, for Jared, it was inspired by the problem posing education that was developed by Paulo Freire in Brazil, and then in other countries later on when he did his literacy work. And so that idea of beginning, and Antoinette, you were just talking about that, is the idea of beginning with a problem that affects and impacts and is known by students, right? In the case of Freire, right, it was adults. It was adults and saying, here's a problem in the community. We don't have potable water.
Right.
What is going on? Why is that happening? How does it happen? How did it come to be? What do we need? And then, of course, as you're saying, the next piece is, well, okay, what can we do about it? Right? Knowing what we know about the world and how it operates in all these different sectors, politically, economically, racially, et cetera, what does that say about this problem? And then the idea is that, well, we need to develop literacy practices so that we can effectively take action in a world which utilizes that as a mode of communication and advocacy. So that problem posing, right, is drawn from his work, and you can see that in Pedagogy. They're pressed is the good first place to look for that.
Absolutely.
And so related to that is, right, is it for community? Right? That's our next question. Does this lesson bring us together? So does it bring us together as a classroom community, as human beings maybe, but especially within the classroom? And can what we learn be applied locally?
Yes.
So again, we see the connections, right? That idea about dialogue, problem posing, and then this idea of it is for community and it's something that can be applied locally, not knowledge and say, oh yeah, it's nice that tree does that thing called photosynthesis. That's great. That's fine. But what's the next step towards that? Right? What else can I do? And what does that mean locally for me? And what action can I take, or others as a collective, what actions can we take? Do you want to do the next one?
Yeah, humanizing. When the students engage in the curriculum, does it alienate them, or does it integrate them as whole human beings? And does it provide them agency to solve the problems within their community that they deem valuable themselves, right? So is it relevant to them? Is it valuable to them? Does it reinforce their social, cultural, linguistic, historical patterns and ways of being? Does it acknowledge their ancestral wisdom? You know, that we all come from a people who have made beautiful and wonderful contributions to this planet. Does it connect them to that so that they can have that kind of agency? Like I said before, the way you teach and how they interact with the curriculum should leave them feeling whole and more like themselves than before. And that's the humanizing piece. This comes into play. You'll hear a lot of African Americans around Black History Month get sick and tired of always tying back to slavery, because the way slavery is depicted in history and in entertainment is it's dehumanizing. It victimizes the watcher, and especially if you're African American. An example of the opposite of that is Samuel L. Jackson and his wife did a piece recently, a 6-part piece called Enslaved, where it humanizes that experience, the slavery experience. And it also included extraordinary ways that we combated being enslaved and risking our lives for freedom, right? And it also humanized European Americans, because they highlighted those who were against slavery and who co-conspired for our freedom. So in humanizing African Americans in the tale and not victimizing them, we also humanized a different narrative about European American and Canadian Americans. This is in North America. They're humanizing agency for our freedom as well. So that humanizing piece is extremely important when you're looking for curriculum. Does it victimize the students? Does it play into the status quo narrative of the folks who need to be saved because they don't have agency within themselves? Or does it highlight reality and history and ability accurately? So like I said, you want to leave the dignity and the relevance and the values of the students intact.
And Yeah, and so the next one that we have is the curriculum democratizing. So will, as part of how the curriculum operates and what's being students are asked to do, will students have and feel the freedom to make choices, right? So again, going back to the idea of problem posing and dialectical, right? And we talked about in dialectical that when we have dialogue in classrooms, we want to have some structured pieces, but we also want to have things that aren't structured, meaning they're not structured by us, the adult. So thinking about, do they have freedom to make choices? Are there moments in the curriculum that say, hey, what is our interest here, right? Are we able to, using the curriculum and how we write it up, right? Because part of us vetting curriculum isn't just to say, I get this curriculum, yep, it seems anti-racist, I'm gonna just do it the way it tells me to do it. You're gonna modify it and change and adapt according to your community, the kids that are in front of you, the parents of those kids, the local problems and issues and strengths that are in the community, but you're also going to do it just to reactive to what students are bringing, right? What they're bringing in terms of their interests and other things we talked about in terms of problem posing for community and all that. But do they have a choice? Do students feel like they have some freedom and some choice making in the direction where their education can lead, right? So do we have some open spaces? Do we have some flexibility for that to happen? And then next, and very much connected to that, if I feel I'm in a democratizing space, then I'm certainly going to feel empowered, right? Yeah. So the next question is this empowering? Can this lead to social justice action in the future? So not only the feeling and the sense of empowerment, but actually saying, okay, now that I have this knowledge, what's my responsibility? My responsibility, hopefully as a young person, is to begin to feel and know that my responsibility is to take action. Now I know what I know. How can I share this knowledge? The principle of each one teach one, but then also that next piece of what's the action that I can take to bring about, to move us closer to social justice.
Absolutely. And in a collective movement as well. So when you're democratizing and empowering, that part of that piece is, am I my brother and sister's keeper? Am I being fair by being fair? Am I teaching and being generous by literally being generous? So it's important that the teacher play a role in the community as well, not as a dictator or authoritarian, because we see what happens when that happens, but as a community member who is also empowered and is also learning from the students. Chris Emden has his 3 C's when it comes to that. If you can, he has a very great example and process on how to engage in that way. And then, is it not nice? When I look at that, I mean, does it get down and dirty and tell the truth? Is it, does it place people in time and space in an accurate way? The best part about that, if you can watch Hamilton's America, David, what is his last name? He plays Thomas Jefferson and Lafayette, and he says,
David Diggs.
Yes, Diggs. He says Thomas Jefferson wrote these great documents, and he also sucked. And both have to be true, right? That's the example of not nice. And our kids see us as adults. They see our hypocrisy all the time, and they're always negotiating that. So they're ready for the not nice conversation. So you can create a space for them to grapple with that concept. My sister said something recently that encapsulates the not nice. She goes, I could take the meat and leave the bone, right? So you can take the meat of the subject matter, and we can practice leaving the bone so that we're not victimized twice, right? Because right now in our state of affairs in the United States, we value niceness as opposed to, is it truthful, right? So this is a time where we can critically analyze how far along have we gotten by being nice, trying to, as my grandmother would say, put sugar on shit. We have to separate the meat so that we don't get victimized twice by erasure of the facts to fit this little box so that we can all look cute in a way, historically.
Yeah, and I think, in connection with that idea of, is it not nice, right? In this, I mean, and like you're saying, an emphasis on this idea of civility, whatever
Mm-hmm.
that means, and which basically means shut up,
Right.
but don't
Amazing.
talk about those things. But the idea that if with young people and all the different subjects that we teach, and all the in a multiple subject classroom in preschool, that if we tell them the truth, that some parts of truth aren't so good, right?
Right.
So like we were saying, right, this idea of how do we, is this avoiding sugar, is this sugarcoating reality,
Right.
right? But if we give kids reality, right, of course, developmentally appropriate ways, but if we give them reality, that now they'll just be like, there's no hope. Right? If
Right.
I tell them about climate change, if I tell them this is what's going on and this is the ways that humans have affected this planet, and these are some ways that we can begin to chip away at that and maybe change it, or not even that part, right? Because that's the hopeful
Mm-hmm.
part.
Mm-hmm.
But if we just leave it and say, this is what's going on, it's like, well, what do you do about that? I have
Right.
no more hope in my life.
Right.
So the last question of Jared's, right, is it for hope? Is it hopeful? Is this curriculum hopeful? Is the idea of possibility present in the curriculum, right? So, and I always, for me, speaking of Paulo Freire, I always go back to, because he was a historical materialist, which meant that it recognizes that history and the way things are right now is not a state of normal, right? The way we know as human beings the world and the world that we live in and the institutions that we create and the ways we interact were created by human beings. So if we are in an unjust, corrupt, et cetera, all the negative things we could say, and we would be right, state of being and society and institutions, human beings created this. So human beings can create something else, right? We're not done, right? So that's where that action piece, what is my next step? What's the next action? Well, how can I move towards something that's different? Because that's what happened to this point. The world has changed. It has remained the same in some ways, but it has also changed. And so how can we be a part of that so that we are not just the objects, not just the objects of history, we're the subjects, right? We are those who can change the world, right?
Right.
So is the idea of possibility for the future present in this curriculum? And we may be showing hope for the future by showing all the incredible things that have happened in the past.
Right.
Right. We have our ancestors to learn from. We are standing on folks' shoulders who have done a lot of work. Mm-hmm. So what does that look for us in this context moving forward? So is it hopeful? That seemed to be,
as you were saying that, what occurred to me is this question. Throughout our modern history, the last maybe 200 years, we went through the Victorian and Edwardian eras where being nice was more valuable than being humane. And I was thinking, could we look back on that time? I have a hypothesis that the more we value niceties and surface level human connection, the more grotesque the atrocities that happen, right? So slavery happened during the Victorian era, where politeness was more so valued than humanity. And look at the Civil War and that atrocity, right? So I'm thinking, we don't want to be too nice. We want to stay in reality in a compassionate way, so we can avoid the holocausts of the world. We can avoid the Jim Crow-ness of the world. We can avoid, the Spanish Inquisitions of the world, because it seems like the more we cave into the status quo of things, the way out of that is so horrific that the truth seems pale in comparison. the truth seems more humane in its comparison. And so when we're talking about integrating these kinds of thoughts, we're basically actually helping the future in a way that allows us to be more humane. There's the Southern strategy that this is the social injustice that's happening right now can directly be linked back to the Southern strategy of using rhetoric to not seem racist, but to still do racism. And so we're suffering today. We're in a pandemic in the middle of social injustice today because we valued the rhetoric of not seeming racist over actually not being racist, over being anti-racist. So I really want folks to really grapple with that. When we rely too much on the rhetoric of it and the politeness and the manners and the etiquette and seeming some way and wanted to sugarcoat curriculum and history, the atrocity that creates in the future for our children is too high of a price to pay. We're paying a very high price right now, and this can be probably connected partly to the Southern strategy of not being outwardly racist anymore because that was just too impolite. I'd rather for us to have grappled with racism back in the day so that we wouldn't have to pay for it now. Thank you, grandparents.
And so, our last three, so that's Jared's list. And we felt it would be really helpful to kind of dig in deep about some explanations and examples of those different questions and what that might look like. But our last three are very much tied to our grounding framework. And the first one most clearly in that the question we would ask in terms of whether this is an anti-racist curriculum or not, or what do I need to do to make it so, is does it clearly and unapologetically call out racism and support the personal academic development of African American and Latinx children, right? Mm-hmm. So we look at Jared's checklist, we could see it as is it truthful, right? That idea, is it not nice, mm-hmm. right? But at the same time, is it humanizing, democratizing? Is it for hope? All of those different things. Does it center our students in the curriculum and really concern itself with the personal development and the academic development of children?
Does it address one or more of the four I's? That is, does it address the ideology, the institutionalization of racism and all the isms? Is it interpersonal and internalized, right? So those are the four I's, specifically because we're addressing, the inequities specifically of brown and Black children, but the inequities of, all of our kids, our Asian and Indigenous children, our low socioeconomic status children, our language, diverse children, linguistically diverse children. We tend to teach inadvertently and internalize an interpersonal racism. So we need to attend to that and to replace those things with healing processes. And that ties back once again to the empowering and the community building and the problem posing and the humanizing aspects of how we teach in the curriculum that we use.
Yeah, and that 4I is focus, really just make sure that when we talk about racism and we talk about being anti-racist, that we're being anti-racist in all of those different areas. So a lot of times, right, when we have conversations about racism or being an anti-racist and what that means, we really focus on the interpersonal manifestations of racism, right? Two people interact, one person says something racist and the other person is affected, et cetera. So those interpersonal situations become like, well, if we just change that and we say, you can't do that, and then the person doesn't do it maybe, then racism is gone. Right. Well, that leaves out that entire context that even allowed that to even be thought that could actually happen. That was something that might be okay and normal. Right. And so, of course, we talk about the 4 I's, we talk about the institutional manifestation of racism, right, which uphold and support and create and change, but also remain the same. But we have the emphasis right in ours about specifically focusing on the internalized and interpersonal, just especially that internalized racism, right? The idea that all folks, right, are affected by in a racist system are affected by racism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some folks benefit much more than others by it, but we are all affected. But that internalized racism, right? This idea that, well, if the world is telling me this,
mm-hmm.
maybe it's true, right? Maybe it is true. Maybe I am this. Maybe I am that. Maybe this is the way I'm supposed to be in this situation or not. And so that internalized piece is something that hopefully this curriculum is attending to.
Absolutely. And then does it undermine, expose, and disprove white supremacy? You know, does it humanize white folk as well? So when we're humanizing African Americans and Latinx children and Asian children and Indigenous children, we also humanize European American and white children as well. So this is exceptionally important because the dialogues usually reinforce somehow, even though we're addressing we're trying to take an anti-racist stance, it's usually about helping the children who are oppressed, but we don't see how white supremacy also dehumanizes white children as well. So we have to have these conversations, and we have to have our examples, analogies, scenarios, demonstrations have to be in reality so that we're not reinforcing the status quo and the racist context in which we've been teaching and learning in. So these slides here, and we will share this presentation. There's an Erasing of History for Racist Reasons video that really contextualizes what we've been talking about. There's a young man who explains how by humanizing Southern history and replacing it with reality, what you could do and what you could teach in its stead, which is more honest, more hopeful, more humanizing for the students. Also, we provided examples of how you could take today's context with COVID-19 and use the vetting document to create curriculum and learning activities in different subject areas. So for literacy and language arts, this is coming from Dr. Etta Hollins's Reliable Teaching Practices for April 5th, 2020. And I'll share that as well. Here are some of the questions that kind of fall in line with the vetting that we're talking about. Does this piece of literature or text assignment facilitate P through 12 student literacy well enough to follow guidelines from the CDC or to avoid becoming prey to deceptive advertising for untested cures and preventions of viruses? Will it help empower African American and Latinx communities who have been disproportionately affected by the virus? A mathematics example here is, do mathematic examples in the curriculum facilitate students being able to make sense of real world examples of local, state, national, and global trends and the impact of COVID-19? For the health curriculum, can the health curriculum be used by elementary school students so that they can learn enough about health to understand how to protect themselves and prevent the spread of the disease, specifically in their community? Here's a science example. Do African American and Latinx high school biology students learn enough about bacteria and viruses to explain mutations and transmission? So you watch the video and you grapple with the examples of a learning experience on the last two slides. And then we engage in a vetting activity discussion, and this should last about 10 minutes. Do the previous subject-specific examples measure up to the vetting checklist shared earlier? And if yes, how? And how might you adjust or refine the curriculum that the answer to the question is no.
Yeah. So one of the things that might be helpful, right, is for you at this moment, not only make sure that you, as Antoinette was saying, to view the video, which gives you some example, but also to look kind of one by one with the different subject specific examples, and ask those questions, right? Does that measure up? So really, do your due diligence in terms of looking at each of those questions, right? And as we were going through those different, the Jared's list and then the 3 additional that we have there, when we looked through those, we did find connections and overlap, right? But it's super important in vetting an anti-racist curriculum to really shoot for, how do I include all these different things? And again, like we said before, there may be things that you want to add to that curriculum, or to, in this case, the subject specific example. So since those examples were pretty straightforward in just a couple sentences, there's going to be some space to fill in there. So we also might assume that, well, it's talking about this issue and that, so we can assume it, but it might be helpful to think about, as it says here, if it's a partial, you're not really sure, yes or no, right? It would be really good to look and say, how might you adjust to refine the curriculum? What are resources that we can bring to bear? And those resources are going to be related to your own expertise, right? They're going to be related to, so you might have a science example and you might be a physical education, a multiple subject teacher, maybe a music teacher watching this. But to think about how can I bring this to bear in talking about something like COVID-19 and the pandemic? Right? What does my discipline, what is my area of expertise, or even personal experience or interest, how might I bring that to bear in this discussion that would help this curricular idea become more anti-racist according to the questions, right? So I think that's kind of a cool thing, that those of you that are doing this right now, you're going to have more time than the original webinar folks did. And you're going to have more opportunities to look things up, right? Just in terms of the time that you have.
Absolutely. And in that time, you vet the curriculum, and I think the concept and the goal that we had was, the reason why those questions center around COVID-19 is because they were relevant. The reason why this thing
still is, sadly.
Yeah, absolutely, is aligned with anti-racist curriculum vetting is because students value their grandparents during this time. We're heading into Thanksgiving when we're recording this. Students value keeping the community safe. So the sign of the times is requiring us to be anti-racist. And we really want to reinforce being anti-racist is about humanizing and bringing people's values on the table. I think much of the time we talk about anti-racism, people hear anti-white, and it's not. It's about humanizing everyone and getting solutions to problems that we all have. And we're saying racism hinders us from connecting in real ways, so that we can't solve problems. We just push them under the carpet and they surface. And when they resurface, they're filled with absolutely more junk that we now have to deal with. So that's something that we really want to get across here, that it's about the humanization process and about solving real problems and getting us all out of COVID, getting us all social justice, getting us all security, right? And well-being and wholeness. It's not about hindering someone else from getting someone else. There's enough for everyone. So pause this, take as long as you want. We say 10 minutes if you're doing a PD, but take as long as you want to re-evaluate the examples that we gave. And if you actually do have time, start looking at your own work. How can you add some of these components to your work to make it more rigorous, more robust, more inclusive, more humanizing, have more relevancy, bring in kids' values. These things it makes the work so much more enjoyable. And taken from us, like we're teachers, like we taught before we were professors. When I did this work, my kids were more engaged, they were more empowered, and my biology state and local scores were always 20 and 30% higher than the state. And I only taught black and brown kids. I only taught kids who spoke multiple languages. So I'm not giving up anything. I'm gaining success as a teacher when I use these materials in this process. So I don't want anybody to go, but if I do all this work, uh, am I sacrificing content? No. Am I sacrificing time? A little bit, but the product that you get, the success that you get, it outweighs everything, right? So my principals would, they would come in my classroom, they would tell me, I ain't worried about you because you're doing it, right? I became a successful teacher by the metric that the state and the local district said, but I became a successful teacher because my kids were successful and whole. So teaching this way, you blow the standardized whatever out the box. You don't even have to worry about it. You don't have to teach to it, right? This is the kind of teaching that we want folks to develop so that you never have to worry about, you know, like I said, am I sacrificing this? No, what you're doing is you're actually reinforcing the humanity of kids. And when you do that, there's no test they can't take, right? And so you can then have the influence to say, your test is weak. It's not really measuring what they actually know. You actually have something to stand on when you really want to do assessment reform. Because you can say, the way we do this, your test is weak and it's useless.
Right.
So,
Right.
and that's kind of where we want to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Being able to advocate for that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So 10 minutes, pause the film and the presentation, and when you're done, we'll be here. So now that you've had an opportunity to discuss how the examples and maybe even your own curriculum measure up to the vetting process, it is really important to enact an anti-racist curriculum. So you've planned it, you've vetted it, now it's time to enact it. So here's some of the components that I've used in my own work, and I'm sure Nick has too. You're supposed to know your students and earn their trust. You can't embed the relevancy and the humanizing and the critical aspects and the hopeful aspects in the curriculum unless you know your students and have earned their trust. And what do we mean by earn their trust? They know that you're fair, that you're generous because you've been that. You're coming from an authentic sense of self, so you know who you are as a cultural, historical, social, linguistic being, and that you know your content. So you could be the nicest teacher on the planet, but if you're still using the teacher's manual, they're going to be like, if this information is so important to learn and you ain't mastered it, why would we trust you to learn, you know, the material? So you have to know your students and the community that you serve, and you have to know your pedagogy, your epistemic practices, and all those things. And then you have to embed culturally sustaining and empowering context to the curriculum. So if you can't find if something in your curriculum is necessary as a skill, but it is covered with all this crap, you're going to have to find things to supplement and remove the crap and give the students the culturally sustaining and empowering context. Then you find the curriculum materials that best increase the skill and knowledge and understandings for the students, but does not deconstruct them and make them assimilate into concepts of their inferiority and white supremacy. Elicit students' responses first because their voice becomes part of the curriculum. You want to make that public. You want to write it on the board, or you want to put it in the chat, or you want to make their ideas public so that they can start communing with each other and synthesizing understandings together. And then you want to integrate funds of knowledge of the students with the culturally sustaining and empowering context through the curriculum. And this is an ongoing process that you do every time you engage with your students and you all commune around curriculum.
Yeah, and I think if I look at this cycle, right, and I think a lot of times the way that we might think about as teachers about knowing my students is definitely when I do teacher education and in my own classroom in the past, the first thing I do is try to get to know my students as quickly as possible and as soon as possible, right? Beginning with names and learning names and pronouncing them exactly the way their parents pronounce their names, et cetera, et cetera. But that if we look at the cycle, the really interesting thing is, yeah, you could do that. And you want to show that eagerness and have some tools and ways of knowing students and earning trust. But if we look at that cycle, we also see that doing all these different things, which we may see as pedagogical moves, right, are actually humanizing moves, right? So that culturally sustaining context to curriculum, finding curriculum materials, eliciting students' responses first, and integrating funds of knowledge, right, of students with the culturally sustaining, empowering context, that leads to knowing your students and earning their trust. Right, and then you do it again, right? So if I'm doing those practices in alignment with the attitude and the intentionality of getting to know my students and becoming worthy, being trustworthy, right, and modeling what that looks like to trust them also, that I trust them in return, that if I also need to be doing all these different pedagogical moves and choices that will then bolster that up too. So I can't just be like, I want to know you. I really do. Right? I got to back it up. My whole way of being and way of teaching has to be about that.
Absolutely.
Right? And I really love, Antoinette, that you put that in there, because I think other models, we may have been able to just put that one out.
Right.
To say, oh, here's the technical. It's not really technical, but if we push it really far, this could be technical. I got to find materials, I got to integrate funds of knowledge. I'm going to elicit student responses. Great. Those are all little moves that we could do. But when we take in the whole context and saying that actually the most central piece of this most likely is knowing my students and earning their trust. Truly, that is an important statement. So in terms of enacting anti-racist curriculum, that now once we found it, now we got to think about the pedagogy of that, the why and the what and the how of what we do. So,
and I think in elaborating on that, you've brought up something exceptionally important. Not only do we earn our students and learn them, right, but we protect them as well. So when we're done at the end of the year with our kids, it is imperative that what you know about that community that you've been a part of for 182 days, it is imperative that you give healing and critical information to their next teacher, so that earning their trust and knowing them becomes easier for the next teacher. Because we put too much onus on our kids to have to learn us every period or learn us every year, right? Our secondary students go through 6 to 7 classrooms a day, and each teacher has her own quirks, and they got to learn us each period. And then we wonder why they act out with some teachers and they don't with others. This is important, right? You have to, hold their hearts close to yours and advocate for them with your peers. So when you're saying, this is the community that I've built in the 3rd grade, it's your duty to tell the 4th grade teacher who this community is, or who these community members are, and how you earn their trust, so that the kids aren't deconstructed every time they go to a new teacher, right? Yeah. This is very important. And so, having a whole class profile and, the little nuances of humanity that you've learned about each one of your kids, you need to be like, so that the new teacher doesn't have to do this process all over again. I think that is super important, and it's something that we don't do as teachers, and it should be a part of our practice, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, whoever is conducting this presentation,
they can answer questions.
They could do Q&A.
Ask me questions about what we just saw.
And elaborate on some of the things. But if you want to talk to us, Here are our email addresses. Please feel free to contact us and we can elaborate, or if it is possible, when COVID lifts, maybe we can help come facilitate or have a panel discussion at your institution. So with that said, this was really good. I think this was my favorite one out of all of them. This was by far like my favorite. I think the teacher practice is my second favorite.
Yeah.
But this one, this particular vetting curriculum really gets to the heart of the matter of what we're trying to do, I think, when we say, I'm an anti-racist teacher. This right here gets to the very philosophy of what that is. And
because I think if people are at the stage, you know, if you're watching this, right, you're at the stage of saying, you're not here to say, I don't want to vet anti-racist curriculum, right? You're not here to say that I don't want to do something. Right? So that willingness, right? That willingness and that openness to say, I don't know much about this, or I don't know as much as I want to. I feel like I want to know in order to do it. Hopefully this presentation, as well as any other support that we can provide, can get folks to make that move. And I think, so the willingness is there, which I'm just super encouraged by folks that are checking this out. And it did occur to me while you were talking, and even before, that in addition to any questions or experiences you're having, if you find anti-racist curriculum that you think are really great and you've vetted it and you're like, this is, or you've modified it some way, I personally, and I know Antoinette too, we would love to see those examples that you're finding as a result of this webinar and any other stuff that you're learning about. So please share those. And again, our emails, as far as I know, will both be here for a while. So
in the house.
So it shouldn't change, and if it does, you can just Google us and figure out where we are then. But
absolutely,
we'll be at Fullerton. But thank you so much, everyone that came, and thank you, Antoinette, for doing this and doing this.
Thank you, Nick.
Appreciate it.